Hello, my name is Henry Clements and I'm a volunteer here at the Museum of American Armor and at the Long Island Living History Association, and today we're at Old Bethpage Village Restoration doing a historical timeline. And today we have different areas and different eras all throughout time, from ancient hoplites all the way through Vietnam. What I represent particularly today is a World War I British officer, specifically from the Royal Irish Rifle Regiment. And if you look over across there, you can see the regimental flag. And that is the flag of the Royal Irish Rifles with all the battle honors up to but not including World War I. What we are looking at here is a typical officer's tent. And inside the tent, this is where the officer would both sleep and work when off the front line. They would periodically come off the front line for periods of weeks, sometimes even months, before going back onto the front line in a rotating schedule, which was something that the British did throughout the war. In the rear, the British officer would have as many creature comforts of home as possible, because it is important to remember that in the British Army in particular, and other armies to a lesser extent, the class lines, the social class lines, were very clearly drawn, in that most British officers were very wealthy. Most British officers, even through World War I, had roots in the nobility. So they came from a completely different class than the soldiers that they served with, and in the rear in particular, they would want to keep as much of the creature comforts of home as they possibly can. If you look to the right at the kitchen, we see a full field kitchen, and we have an enlisted soldier cooking, prepping, and cleaning. That would be what we call a batman, or an assistant to an officer. Officers, especially the higher rank they got, would have their own servants with them. Going back onto the track that most officers who were extremely wealthy or noble, they would take their servants from home with them to the military. They would go to the war and they would give their servant a uniform and a rank, usually a little bit higher rank, so they could get a little bit more money, and said, okay, you're in the army with me now and we're going to war. And that's how it happened a lot. So the officer in the rear would have his quarters inside. We've done our best to replicate as close as possible to something akin to what their quarters would look like. Some things that you would see in an officer's quarters you wouldn't see anywhere else is a wash basin to prep in the morning. Basin, candles, mirror, lantern, pitcher, because no officer would walk out without being clean shaven and presentable to their troops. The British officer was always imperatively prepped, cleaned, and ready for duty, to set an example to his soldiers. No tent would be complete without a portrait of the king. There would always be a portrait of the king in every officer's tent. Now, we have our beds, the batman's bed, the officer's bed. Not typically would they stay in the same tent. We do this for expediency's sake at the reenactments, but normally the enlisted man and the officer would never share the same exact quarters. Some things that we see the officers would have that are not typical of other ranks would be their own trunk from home. So they could bring extra uniforms and comforts from home, extra clothes, things like that. And this trunk would travel wherever they traveled. When they went on the front lines, it would go into storage, but when they came back, their trunk with all their stuff would be ready. Some other things that we would see from officers that we would not see the enlisted have is a portable tea set. This is one of my favorite items that we have. This tea set breaks down completely and you can put it all together, and then it goes into this pouch, and this pouch gets carried with them over their shoulder or on their equipment belt. Not something the average enlisted person would actually have. Additionally, officers had something very new and wondrous called a flashlight. This is what a flashlight would have looked like back then. Okay, and you would have a switch up top, a toggle switch up top that would turn it on and turn it off. And you would have your bulb right here. These were very new, so not everybody had them back then. Additionally, no officer would travel without at least one pipe. Cigarettes were not in fashion yet. They did not become in fashion until after World War I, and more so even after World War II. They were still considered more of an effeminate smoking material. Cigars were the preferred method, but cigars didn't survive very well in the trench environment, and British were not much into cigars so much as they were into pipes. So most British officers would have a pipe with them. Additionally, something unique that you don't necessarily see is, and mind you, a lot of the officers would buy their own kit. The extras would come out of their own pocket, but then again, they were wealthy. So this is another thing that an officer could carry. And you see the straps. This could actually strap onto their belt and they can have it with them at all times. What is this? Well, again, not wanting to be away from the comforts of home, you would have a bottle for some alcohol, spirits, and a sandwich tin, so that they would always have a snack. I don't know if they were all exactly the same. I've only seen this one ever, but this one is actually solid silver. But again, the officer would probably pay for this out of their own pocket. Another significant difference between the officers and the enlisted, if we look at the uniform here, here's a typical British enlisted soldier's uniform. Very practical, warm, durable, functional. Very good piece of equipment. The officers, however, would have linings in their uniforms. This is wool, this is gabardine. The lining could be silk or satin, okay? So they would wear a much higher quality uniform. Even the breeches, if you look at the breeches, these are much higher quality, the boots. So that was another place where things differed. Another difference or unique thing about being an officer in the British Army, other militaries do it too. We see it in the German military, we see it in the French to a certain extent, but British more so than ever, is that they will carry something called a swagger stick. And the swagger stick is a symbol of the officer's authority. And this goes all the way back to Roman times, which I just found out from one of our visitors was helping me out on this and educating me on this. But this went all the way back to Roman times, where the Roman centurion would carry a rod along marches and in battles, and only the Roman centurion carried it, and it was used to discipline slow marchers, or it would be used to discipline soldiers that would get out of line or needed discipline. So this typical example here is nothing more than a wooden dowel with a little bit of leather over it, the cheapest, and if they issued them, this would be the closest one to an issue one. But as we mentioned before, this is an Irish regiment. And Irish regiments, regardless of North or South, would carry something to make them uniquely Irish. Many officers in the Irish regiments carried their swagger sticks made of Irish blackthorn, which is a very popular piece of wood, and it's actually an endangered piece of wood. They're running out of it. But many of the officers would carry an Irish blackthorn swagger stick. Another option would be a custom-made one. This one is made out of rattan. And if you can see, it's hard to see, but the regimental crest is on the silver cap. So this would be something that they would generally have personally made and pay for out of their own pocket. Another option would be a full-size walking stick. This is also Irish blackthorn, and you can see on the head of the walking stick is the regimental crest. One of the things that people did, and this was the enlisted and officer alike, the hat badges here on the caps, they would take these cap badges, nail them onto a stick, and now we've got a regimental walking stick. Or they could nail it onto here, and now we have what is called this is called a shillelagh, and they would take the hat badge and put it on here and make it kind of customized to the regiment. This would not necessarily be something that would be carried by an officer. This is more of a enlisted man's thing. Back home in Ireland, people carry shillelaghs all the time as a form of self-defense. So if you look at this, you can see the regimental crest. It's got a shamrock on the front, and then written in cursive along the handle, it actually says shillelagh. And it's got a little lanyard, so you could wrap it around your wrist to carry. And that would be the shillelagh. Some other typical things that you would see with the officer would be a notebook to write, take notes, a pay book, compass and binoculars, and then over here you can see the compass case, the gas mask case, there's a canteen, a helmet, and this musette bag, ditty bag, whatever you want to call it. It had a lot of different names. This was issued to British officers, but this became very popular with American officers, and a lot of them private purchased these during the war. And these were still being used during World War II, and I use it for all my stuff, and it's a very effective piece of equipment. And then lastly, is a good rain poncho, because the trenches could get somewhat wet. Speaking to the uniform itself, some specifics about the uniform. The rank on this uniform is not on the collar and it's not on the shoulder boards as we're used to. In the early war, officers' rank were on the cuffs. It changed around 1916, but as late as the end of the war, you could see both, either on the cuff or up on the shoulder boards. This rank, the single crown, is symbolic of a major. The 3 stripes also correspond to being a major. The 3 stripes here are service stripes. Each stripe represents a year overseas during the war. On this side, this stripe, this bar, is meaning you were wounded. It's similar to a Purple Heart. If you were wounded, you wore this stripe, and you can see the same on the enlisted soldier's coat here. So they could be sewn on, or they could actually be metal. And then up here is a trench whistle. This is a very convenient way to carry the whistle to signal during a battle, so you would always have a trench whistle somewhere. And then, of course, the officer's sword. The British officers did still carry swords throughout the war, not always into the trenches, but they would have them available. So it would go up here like this for walking around, and then you could take it off the hook and drop it for when you needed to use it. Additionally, we have the officer's pistol, which would be a Webley Mark 6, a revolver. It's a top break revolver. They would load it, click it, and this would be their primary sidearm, the primary weapon that the officers would carry. And then they would have their ammo pouch right here. Generally, this would be about all you would see on an officer's belt, unless they added some extra specifically. The compass, the bass mask, those were all straps, and you would just throw it over your shoulders and carry it as a bundle or put it all in the bag. The last thing on the uniform to be of note is my age in real life. I'm 57. To be 57 in World War I, as an officer, as a major, you would have had to have a career before the war. Going back, you probably would have been a veteran of the Boer War, which was 1900 to 1902. British versus the Boers in South Africa. So these 2 ribbons here symbol service in the Boer War. So that's why we wear those. Now, if we do an impression where it's after World War I, then we'd have these 2, and then there would be the 3 ribbons that everybody would be awarded during the war. The Mons Cross, the Victory Medal, and the Service Medal, and that would go underneath. So you'd have the 3 ribbons, and then possibly the 2, but those 3 ribbons would only be appropriate to wear after, a post-war event, because it has the Victory Medal. And that's pretty much all I got.
Thank you, Henry.